if you care too much about what other people are going to think, then you're never going to do anything worthwhile. If you sit there waiting for your clicks and your likes, then you're not learning, you're not improving.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Strong Stoic Podcast. I am your host, Brandon Tumblin. Before I introduce my guest, allow me to announce that this podcast is part of the Walled Garden Podcast Network. Consider checking out thewalledgarden.com. Also, consider checking out my group chat on Telegram, where you can get involved in discussions with other Strong Stoics. That's the Strong Stoic channel chat. Also, check me out on pretty much everywhere. I'm all over social media, so really, if you want to follow me, Instagram, Twitter, I'm all over there. Facebook as well. You can head out there. My articles are on Medium and the Stoic Gym. And I think that's everything I have to announce. So let me introduce my guest. Today I have the privilege of speaking with Judith Stove. Judith is an Australian writer and philosopher, as well as a regular contributor to the Walled Garden. So she's part of the Walled Garden community that I just spoke about. She has published 2 books on the life and times of Jane Austen. She recently did an event on that, which was spectacular, so you should check that out. You can find that at the Walled Garden. And many articles on history and literature as well that Judith has written. In this episode, Judy and I talk about strength, which of course is one of my favorite topics. It is the Strong Stoic Podcast after all. So we talk about strength and how maybe it's best to conceptualize the idea of virtue, that ancient idea of arete, the aim of life, at least in some capacity for most traditions, including Stoicism. We speak about conceptualizing virtue as strength. So I really enjoyed speaking with her on this topic. So without further ado, please welcome Judith Stove. I figured we could talk a little bit about what you mentioned there about virtue and strength. I mean, we've only had a few exchanges, but the couple that we have, I feel like we're aligned on some ideas. And when you said that to me about thinking about virtue as we that's the word we use now to describe, arete is what the ancient philosophers use, and instead maybe using a word like strength, it really piqued my interest because from the start of this podcast, I've always been trying to figure out how strength can where it fits in the philosophy of Stoicism and any way of life. And in the past, I've tucked it under courage and fortitude, which is probably true. But I'm starting to more take the position that maybe it's something that's a lot even more fundamental than that. Maybe that is virtue in and of itself. So I'll just let you get into it here. And first of all, just welcome and thank you so much for chatting with me. I'm so excited to have you on and take advantage of your wisdom here today. So welcome to the podcast. And I guess as a starting point, where did that idea come of considering maybe arete as strength?
Okay, well, thank you for having me on, Brandon. It's a great pleasure. So just a little bit about me. I'm a writer and researcher from Sydney, Australia. I've studied Latin and Classical Greek at university. Mostly these days I write about literature, history and philosophy. I've joined the Walled Garden as a contributor. I've got a grove on there called Roots of the Garden, which is where I'm going to be discussing and writing about key works in the Western philosophical tradition. And Simon and I are about to start up again our series Soul Searching with Seneca. So that's where we explore the wonderful Senecan letters to Lassalius. And we hope that other people are going to get involved with that. So there's lots of exciting things going on. But to this issue of virtue as strength, so I've been thinking about virtue in the Western tradition for a long time now, quite a few years. And I guess a lot of people may not realize that in the West, we did have a virtue tradition that survived pretty much 2,000 years, really pretty well until maybe after the Second World War, because it came through through Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, and it was transmitted to the Christian tradition as well. So that's basically the virtue framework that we know from the Stoics, so wisdom, justice, self-control, and courage. So Plato was the first to kind of formalize it, but he wasn't the first person to write about it or to refer to it. And interestingly, I think the very first writer to refer to those four key virtues was the poet Pindar, who was a Greek poet in a couple of generations prior to Plato. And what Pindar is most famous for is writing poems about athletic contests. and, uh, and he mentions the four key virtues in connection with a winner in one of the boys' athletic contests not long after the Persian Wars in 479 BC. So you can see that link between athletic competition and key virtues was made very early on, even prior to Plato. So this framework that Plato formalized, Aristotle wrote about, the Stoics wrote about, and as I said, was transmitted into the Christian tradition, it wasn't exactly a perfect fit with the Christian worldview. So it was, for a long time, particularly in the early Christian centuries, there was a bit of a love-hate relationship going on with virtue, because virtue, after all, is human excellence, whereas the standard Christian position was rather that humans can't really achieve anything good without the assistance of God's grace. And so the person we associate most with that kind of approach is St. Augustine, who was uh, active in the 400s AD. And so that was so, but on the other hand, the early Christian theorists knew they couldn't really appeal to educated pagans, which is what they really wanted to do. They wanted a lot of educated converts. They couldn't really appeal to those people who'd been brought up in probably a virtue tradition. They couldn't really appeal without making some place in their worldview for virtue. And so then you get people like the church father Tertullian. So that's going back a bit to the time of Marcus Aurelius. And Tertullian said things like, even Seneca is one of us at times. And by that he meant that there's a lot of Seneca that can be incorporated into the Christian worldview. And another way in which the virtue framework was transmitted was from the writer called Boethius, who was in the 6th century of the Christian era. Now, he was a Christian, but his great work, Consolation Philosophy, doesn't really have anything Christian in it at all. What it has is a lot of Platonist stuff, a lot of Stoic influenced stuff about virtue. And the Consolation Philosophy was a hugely influential work in the medieval world. In fact, I think it was the single most copied book in the early Middle Ages. And so that's another way in which these virtue ideas got transmitted into the Christian world. So that was kind of how that virtue idea got transmitted. And then you've got Thomas Aquinas bringing Aristotle's ideas into the Christian tradition, and then Plato's ideas were kind of rediscovered in the Renaissance, and that was influential as well. So in a sense, those ideas were very key until really the early 20th century, I would say, when you've got 2 world wars, you've got the rise of psychoanalysis, which is kind of quite antithetical to a virtue approach. And yeah, after the Second World War, you've kind of got the sex and drugs revolution, which of the 50s and 60s, and I think that it was only at this point really that a virtue idea kind of completely got lost from culture. So that's kind of a long-winded introduction, but it kind of gives us a bit of a sense of where we've come from. And I don't know what you think about this, Brandon, but it seems to me that both what we're involved in, like kind of the Stoic revival, and also the rise of someone like Jordan Peterson, are both aspects of a bit of a reaction against a culture that really lacked a lot of moral frameworks. Now, I know a lot of people in the broader Stoic community would disagree with that, partly because they don't have a lot of time for Peterson and his ideas, but it seems to me that maybe from the 90s onwards, there's been a bit of a hunger in culture for a framework, for some ideas around personal responsibility, and that's partly maybe where we're all coming in. So that was by way of a long introduction to where we are now. I don't know what you think about that. And then we can maybe go on to talk about virtuous strength.
No, that was a lovely introduction. I have so many questions. The Peterson thing, I just want to touch on that briefly, and I don't want to spend too much time because he is. I mean, I bring him up quite a bit, but yeah, he does seem to get a lot of. I don't want to say hate is a bit of a strong word, but from those in the philosophical community, he tends to kind of get torn down a little bit, and I've tried to understand why, because I do think that he differs in some ways, but I think fundamentally he is about virtue ethics. I mean, he's all about sort of taking direct ownership over your life, and he doesn't seem to focus too much on the let's say the quote quote unscientific religious beliefs. Like he tends to really focus on what you can do here and now to make your life better. And I don't know why he gets some of that, but it is interesting that I would also see that the fact that he's more popular now as well as a sign of exactly what you mentioned, that it does seem to be there's this resurgence of virtue ethics. And it's probably, I think, broadly speaking, it's because we sort of reached a point in scientific discovery where uh, I suppose a lot of the claims from the church have been put into question. And so now we're at a place where, well, what do we do? Because we still need meaning in our lives. And if we're no longer getting it from the source that we've had for, about 2000 years, where do we go with that? And so that's sort of an interesting thing about that. And maybe we can segue into this a little bit, because I'm curious how you think about faith in virtue ethics, because I feel like when people think about faith, they think about something like voodoo belief, and it's actually not, in my opinion, it's not what it is at all. Faith isn't, there's no evidence for your beliefs. It's more like, okay, this is what we know, and we're humble enough to know that we can't know everything, but we're willing to based on what we know now, we're willing to head off in a certain direction and hope that we get to where we want to go. But I'm curious, from someone that's way more knowledgeable about the history of this stuff than I am, how do you think the idea, or even like the virtue, quote quote virtue of faith, fits into sort of that virtue ethic framework?
That's a great question. I think there's a number of approaches people take to this, obviously. So you've got some people like the traditional Stoic movement who are quite firm on insisting that the Stoic virtue approach requires that some kind of faith commitment. And then you've got others, and I say I would be in that camp, I guess, whose commitment to virtue ethics is more along the lines of what Cicero outlined in his very influential book on duties, De Officiis. And in book one of that work, he sets out a framework which is quite naturalistic. He starts from, well, humans are in the animal kingdom, we live in communities. When we see someone who's acting bravely, we think, oh, yes, that's courage. When we see someone who's acting fairly, we think, yep, that's justice. When we see someone who's disciplined and rigorous, we think, yes, they're acting with self control. So he sets out a very naturalistic account of how the best way to live in human communities is by living virtuously. And that, as I say, that book was incredibly influential throughout the early modern period. I think we've tended to have lost that kind of like that approach to some extent. But I also think that, and I've written about this, I think Jordan Peterson's approach, which sets human life very much in its evolutionary framework, he also has a fairly evolutionary or sort of naturalistic approach to acting responsibly. So I think those are quite compatible. I think, too, I think the Stoic approach, as you're aware, kind of uh, demands or at least suggests a providential cosmos. So maybe if we have a faith commitment, it might look something more like, well, yes, it seems to me that there are a lot of things that are very mysterious still about organic processes in the world. I think that's something that even people from a science background would admit. But also B, there is a lot of order. There's a lot of regularity. And that's a very basic commitment, I guess, but I think it's one that's perfectly compatible with a virtue ethics approach.
I would absolutely agree. That idea of providence as an act of faith is interesting to me, and I'm curious to know how you think about this, because Nietzsche sort of had this. He was sort of like an inflection point in some sense, where he famously pronounced God is dead, and part of what that meant was what I spoke to earlier, where our sort of scientific discovery has caught up with itself. And he even thought, oddly enough, that the Christians' value to logos was so strong that it wreaked havoc on it. It destroyed itself, basically, because it was so dedicated to seeking truth. And so I've been thinking about this concept lately of things like that, truth and untruth, because even so let's say the idea of everything happens for a reason, which is something like providence, right? You can go through life, and I mean, I don't really believe that everything happens for a reason, but I actively engage that, and I actively sprinkle that in my life because it seems to work out better. It seems to be like maybe not a literal truth, but like a philosophical truth, meaning if you act in that way, things seem to get better for you. And so it's sort of really it's really confusing for me because it's almost like an untruth in some ways, but it's a philosophical truth in what I think is in the definition of it. So I don't know. What do you think about that? Nietzsche's pronunciation of God is dead, and the implications of that.
Yeah, Nietzsche's, as you say, is absolutely key to kind of what came after in terms of what I was referring to earlier with the psychoanalytic approach. And sorry, just a sidebar on Nietzsche. He's notorious for dissing the Stoics, but actually
Yeah.
he had a lot more time for the Stoics earlier on in his career. So yeah, he was quite against that idea of the Stoic providence. But I totally take your point. I think, as I say, for a start, that there is still, even scientists would admit, there's much that we don't know about what is actually taking place in the world, and particularly with organic life. And the Stoic idea that everything is interconnected, that every species and every individual in a species, whatever they do, they're all linked strongly and unavoidably in a huge organic network. And so, on that basis, uh, I think maybe Nietzsche was uh, he was quibbling a bit about the Stoic point of view. He refused to see the kind of value you're seeing in that approach as a way of life. And I think if we're talking about a way of life, that's what we're looking at, things that work, things that are practical. And yes, taking the idea that everything's connected, my actions are important, is a very practical way. And as you say, it tends to have good results.
I,
Certainly, I would say better than better than Nietzsche's approach.
yes, I would agree. And it the way you described that, it reminded me. Have you seen Afterlife by chance?
No. Oh,
Okay.
the series.
With Ricky Gervais.
Yes, I've seen part of it. Yeah, it's great, isn't it?
Oh, it's so great. But there's this scene right at the end. It's the last episode, and he's in this child hospital. Well, basically, they're treating cancer, and he's there for his job. He's interviewing these two kids, but it's so interesting because he meets this kid in the hallway, and they sort of talk, and the kid was watching him from afar for a while, and he's funny, of course, as Ricky Gervais, but he says you're funny, and you should come in more and spend time with me and make us laugh pretty much, and he says okay, yeah, I'll come in tomorrow. I'll come in tomorrow until you're better. And then the kid, which just rips you in half, he says, well, or until I go to heaven. And up until this point, the character is Tony, I think is his name. He's made it very clear that he doesn't believe in God. He doesn't believe in heaven. He's just, listen, we're here, we die, enjoy life while it's here, but then you die, and that's it. And then he's confronted with this question by this dying child of, do you believe in heaven? And the child asks him, he says, do you believe in heaven? And so you can kind of see this realization on his face, that very point that you made, that, well, no, but the question is saying that truth the best thing right now? Is that going to be the best thing for the situation? And I think you would be just completely foolish to think that you telling a dying child, oh yeah, no, heaven's definitely not real. I think it would be atrocious of an act. But he played that part so powerfully because you can kind of see that battle that we're all facing, sort of between faith and reason, that guides our whole life.
Yes, I can see that would be incredibly powerful. But yeah, maybe let's get back to
Yeah.
virtuous strength.
Before we start crying.
That's right. So, um, oh, I'm sorry. I'll just mention first of all, I was looking up virtue in the Oxford English Dictionary, and the meaning that we use most, the one that has this moral philosophical valence, that's been current in English for at least 1,000 years. So that's certainly there. But another meaning of it that came to at various times was this idea of power, strength, and it could be even like a property of some physical substance. That's also in the term virtue. So this idea of power, capacity is been there all along. And so that, I think, gives a bit more support to this idea, maybe thinking about virtue as a strength. And so it fits with that etymological history. But another thing it does is preserving the sense of the Latin word virtus, which is where we get our word virtue from. And as you're probably aware, the word virtus is linked etymologically to the Latin word vir, which means a man. So it was originally masculine, strength or force. But another reason it's a good way of understanding it is that in our culture, and yeah, just going back to the fact that our culture doesn't really otherwise have much of an idea about virtue, but our culture does like the idea of strength in the gym and athletic performance. Another good thing about thinking about virtue as a strength is that it works well in an abstract sense, like strength in general, but it also works well in terms of an individual strength. So we can think of a particular talent or pursuit which corresponds to an individual virtue. So what do you think about that? That thinking about virtue, both physical and mental, has some usefulness.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can separate the two. I think it's possible because clearly there are people who are incapable of physical prowess who we would say are very stoic and are very strong. But there's a real strong connection between the two. And I think particularly for children, for teenagers, that's why we have sports in school so much. The physical aspect is a powerful medium to learn the mental aspect. And I think that's where it is. I think there's something, as Stoics, we can sit down and the idea is we can reason through much. And there's truth to that. However, there's something that's visceral and real about physical activity. It's unmistakable. Like if you lift something heavy, you feel it. You can't not feel it. You feel it. And so I think, and also the process of physical training, the process of like athletic achievement, I think it naturally puts you on this road to become more stoic and to become virtuous. I mean, I've spoken to lots of high-end athletes, and there's this reoccurring spirit. There's this spirit that animates them all, and it is something like the stoic spirit. So I don't think you can. I think you can separate the two in extreme cases, but I think generally speaking, it's such um, it's such a great medium to learn something like stoicism that I think it's foolish to not even consider it.
Yeah, and you're right to point to that progressive aspect. With when we're learning music or learning a sport, obviously it's progressive. And as you say, you're absolutely right in pointing out that sport in our culture is kind of a proxy for kids learning those virtuous behaviours. I think that's for certainly, say, something like martial arts or in an individual sport or team sports, that's where kids learn to act uh, courageously with self-control. You can't progress in music or in sport without the virtue of self-control for a start. You can't progress in anything essentially without a routine and without discipline. I suppose uh, one question that does come up, and this is a question that I'm currently addressing in my blog posts on Plato's Dialogue Meno, the central question in that dialogue is, well, can virtue be taught? And obviously there's very interesting considerations about that. And it's a very difficult question. Obviously we think something like music can be taught. You can, if your child is good at music, well, you get a music teacher for them, or if they're good at tennis, you get them a tennis coach. But do we think that virtue can be taught in the same way as a musical or a sporting kind of skill? So obviously we're not going to get a definitive answer on that, but that's one interesting question that is raised when we try to think of virtue in this kind of context.
Yeah.
Maybe
That
we need to think of it as in terms of it wouldn't be taught exactly, but it's going to be acquired progressively, and part of that process may be from role models. I mean, I think role models are important in growing in virtue as they are in say sport or music. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I agree, but I think like what's hard about this is that, I mean, you're right. You have to. It's something that you have to sort of experience and develop yourself. But I do think, in a sense, it maybe not taught, but certainly guided. And then it kind of begs the question: is even like a piano teacher really quote quote teaching you, or is it more best thought of as like guidance? Because you can imagine like a child. So I had my nephew here last week, and he's like 8, so he's probably just at the point where he can push a lawnmower. So I said, okay, get out there and mow my lawn, and I'll pay you for it and everything. But trying to build a bit of character, right? And so he's out there, and he can barely push the thing, right? Like it's not moving. And he's a skinny kid. He's a great kid, but he's a small kid. So now I'm not saying that this is, I'm like the perfect role model or anything like that, but I watched him and I said, okay, well, this is going to take me longer if I have to help him, but what's the focus here? Well, I'm trying to help him grow a little bit. So I put my hand on the side of the mower and I pushed it just enough where we can mow the lawn. And so he's still pushing, he's still putting an effort, but I'm giving him just enough of a nudge to kind of get the job done. And I think that's what it's like. And I think it's so easy for us in our busy lives and in our desire to protect our children and the people that we care about to say, you know what, why don't you go watch TV and I'll do the lawn and we'll be done quicker. The harder path is to say, no, no, let me walk along you at 1 mile an hour, helping you just enough while we mow this. And it's going to probably take like an hour and a half. Right. But so I think it's maybe that's like a great illustration of like what it looks like. It's not so much, quote, quote, teaching them. It's more like just nudging them and guiding their path and making sure they don't stray too far.
What a great story, Brandon. Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. Um, I think I think, as I say, sports are a proxy for a lot of these skills. But yeah, I mean, I think mowing the lawn is a great example of another way of doing it. I don't know if what it's like where you live, but here in Australia, the schools are actually supposed to have what's called a values framework that is supposed to be incorporated into curricula. Now, as it happens, I don't think it actually is taken much notice of, and it hasn't been revised for many years. And when I went to look at the values framework, it was kind of wishy washy, and it seems to me, well, maybe there's scope for having a look at a real virtue framework like the classical one um, in this context, and bringing it into school curricula a bit more. I think we could certainly do better with the kind of values that we think would be good for kids to learn. I mean, I think what you're trying to teach with the lawn mowing is absolutely key. Taking responsibility, attempting something that's a little bit too difficult for now, but it's age appropriate and it will be guided. And I think there's scope for trying to work out what the values are that we want our kids to learn. And certainly, I think the classical framework would be a great place to start with that.
Mm. Yeah, we should dig into what that might look like. It seems like we do that naturally with some things. Like I learned that when you talk to children, you naturally, for lack of a better word, dumb down your language to make sure that they can understand. And then over time, as their language skills improve, you start using bigger words just to the point where they can learn. So it's kind of like that balance between chaos and order. It's enough that they can understand, but then there's a little bit, maybe there's a couple words there I don't understand and I have to ask about or try and understand a bit better. And I think maybe that's the same approach that we need to take with philosophy as well. So how do you think you'd even go about doing something like that? Maybe distilling it in the because we don't do a similar thing in Canada. So I'm curious how you distill that into the courses or the structure.
Yeah, so this values framework that's there now, it's from 2009. So it lists, I think, about 8 or 9 values, and they're things like um, integrity, honesty. Look, I've lost track of some of the others, but unfortunately, yeah, they're a little bit wishy washy and they're quite ambiguous. So, uh, yeah, I think it would be uh, I think if there were a commitment, I think it could be done to bring it into lessons, all kinds of lessons, English, maybe not maths so much, but physical, anything to do with PE or sport. I think all these things could have a place if there was a uh, cultural desire for it to happen. But yeah, we've got to be. I mean, I think, as I say, part of the reason why these values look pretty wishy-washy is our culture is pretty confused about what our values really are. I mean, we've got social media and reality television presenting one set of values, narcissism, greed, materialism, and we've got parents who essentially see that, don't necessarily want, well, some parents may have no objection, but a lot of parents see that and think they want something quite different. But I think it takes some articulating to work out what those values really should be. And yeah, it would be great to see a bit more virtue education in the broader system. But as
I
I say, I think sport is a proxy for a lot of these values anyway.
yes,
Um,
yeah. Let's
so I
let's dig.
think
Well, let's
kids
dig
are
into
learning
that.
it. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, let's dig into
So
that. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, well, I've got two sons who are adults now, and both of them did both individual kind of sports, and one of them did martial arts, the other was a distance runner. They're kind of individual, but they both also did team sports. And I remember seeing them learn um, how to win in a team, but also how to lose, and that's very important as well. And that's a very stoic lesson. Things will not always go your way. It's very important to learn that on this occasion, yeah, maybe the umpire made a wrong decision, or maybe the other team did something that wasn't quite right or ethical. But that's a very important life lesson to learn that, well, that's not the end of everything. That's not a reason to get angry yourself. I would say that I think some kids aren't learning the right lessons from sport. I'm just recalling an episode where one of the team sports, my younger son was in a cricket game, and a kid on the other team got out, and he was whacking his bat against a tree and yelling. And obviously, the lessons from the sport had not been well assimilated by that child and his parents. The lesson that the Stoic lesson, that things will go wrong, you will get out in sport, and that's part of the great framework of what we're working in. So a lot of these lessons from sport are to do with living and working in a community, and that's, yeah, where kids are hopefully learning the right message.
Yeah, and I think even that case where you have the kid that's really upset that he's losing and he's making a big show of it. I would argue that over time, sport weeds those people out, or it weeds out the behavior, because I think one of the biggest lessons that you learn through sport is that you have to focus more on the bigger picture and the long-term goal. And here's a great example. If you're the best basketball player on the team, don't you're still not entitled to hog the ball. You still have to pass the ball. And it's very tempting to hog the ball. It's very tempting and easily justifiable to not pass the ball to a player that's, say, quote, quote, less competent than you because, oh, well, we want the point. We want to win, right? But that's the wrong way to look at it. When you look at it in that perspective, you're looking at short term. You're looking at how can we win this game? But what you're not looking at is how can we win the most amount of games in the future, or how can we all play together and build this relationship so that we can go further in the future. And so I would argue that sort of this focus from a short-term mindset to one that's more of like delayed gratification, to one that's more of, okay, how can we win more over time as opposed to immediately right now. And that in and of itself starts to weed out over time. Of course, it's slow and it doesn't happen to everyone, but it weeds out that sore loser behavior. It weeds out the person who hogs the ball. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's very true, and it brings us back to another aspect of this strength analogy, which is consistency. So if you've got a team where you've got four consistent players and one high-paid star, basically the four consistent players are just as valuable and maybe more valuable on some levels than the high-paid star because of that consistency. They're not going to necessarily score the most points, but they're going to be there. They're going to perform on a regular basis. And that's, again, one of the key issues or key aspects in Stoic thought of progressing in virtue is consistency. It's practice. It's being reliable. It's not everyone's going to be the star of the team by definition, but everyone can be that consistent performer and the person who does their best on a regular basis. So I think you've highlighted a very important point there, Brandon, for sure.
Now, I want to play devil's advocate here because obviously there's things called jocks, which I don't know if you use that term in Australia, but in America, it's like the kind of the player that's probably the best on the team, and he's very arrogant. He doesn't have any humility. He's certainly not what you would call a stoic. So I don't know what do you think about that as a devil's advocate position?
Well, the most famous jock in history was Alcibiades, and he was Socrates' most famous failure. so, so yes,
Yeah.
the jock problem is always with us. Alcibiades could be taught all the theory. He had the best teacher ever, and he still was not principled. He was not reliable. He was not self-controlled, and he was not wise. So yes, I think the jock problem is going to be with us.
Yeah.
but yeah, long term, as you point out, being the consistent player, the reliable player, the player who's progressing and improving, is much more fundamental to a functioning community, which is what a sport team is. It's a community.
Hmm. So where do you think humility fits in with that? Do you see humility? I've always seen that as sort of the spine of self-improvement, right? And but it's also you could also almost use it interchangeably with strength. I don't know how do you fit humility into even into the Stoic framework? How do you fit that in?
Okay, so if you look at Epictetus, for instance, he's always very humble, and he's always reminding his students, who, by the way, these were the aristocratic sons of people high in their community. So they would have been your jocks. They were your jock students, a lot of them. He's reminding them to be humble, but at the same time, being humble doesn't necessarily mean that you don't improve yourself. There's a very famous image where Epictetus says he's not going to be a pro athlete like Milo of Croton, who was a very famous wrestler from hundreds of years before. But he says, I'm not going to be like Milo, but that doesn't mean I'm going to neglect my body. And so he's saying, yeah, be humble about your own capabilities, but don't neglect them. Don't neglect your obligation to improve whatever abilities you do have. And that's, I think, it's perfectly compatible to say to be humble, to recognize that you're not going to be, in all probability, you're not going to be the jock and you're not going to be great. But that's not a reason not to do your best to improve what capacities you do have. And in fact, society relies on everybody doing what they have the capacity to do to the best of their ability. That's what any job will require you to do. It doesn't mean you're going to be the best or the most recognized at that, but it does require you to recognize what you can do and do it as well as you can. So
Hmm.
I think that's both a humble and a productive position.
Yeah, anything short of your best does have a negative impact on the world.
Correct.
That's interesting. That's a very strong Dostoevsky idea, which you brought up, but it's also, I think, an idea that might not be as well discussed. But I also think that's a very fundamentally Stoic idea. That idea that, listen, like you can only use the excuse of it's outside of my control once you maximize everything that's within your control.
100%.
And too many people, I feel, do the opposite. They when they look at the dichotomy of the dichotomy of control, they go right to that's outside of my control, that's outside of my control, that's outside of my control. They don't even think about maximizing their agency on what's within your control, and I think that should be the first step.
Yeah, and that's why was one other reason why I really like Cicero's approach, starting from the point of view that we're all living in communities, we're all social beings. We're the most social of the social animals. Let's
Yeah.
take that as our starting point. We're not isolated Nietzschean individuals, floating around in a vacuum. We are in communities. We're all born into families. We're not thrown into the world, as Heidegger put it. We're actually raised. Most of us are fortunate enough to be raised in families, and that gives us our starting point in communities. So that's for me a preferable starting point, and it makes a lot more sense about with the virtues when you realise that they're all social. They're all about humans making the best decisions for their groups and their communities.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So, and as we talk about a lot of these terms, virtue, strength, and even like humility, and then you can get into the cardinal virtues: justice, wisdom, courage, temperance. I mean, what makes these topics hard for me is they're so interconnected. And this kind of gets to the point that we made earlier where, you think about something like virtue and you can almost say, well, actually, it's something more like strength. But these terms are so interconnected, and I think that's been illustrated in the past by artists how interconnected these terms are. That is almost like when you say something like courage, it's like the courageous act is also the one that is wise and that is just and that is temperate. And for something to be it works with all the cardinal virtues, is that they're so interconnected that it's hard to even talk or think about them if you just pluck them out and isolate them, right? And I think that's how we can kind of think about strength as maybe something that's more, uh, let's say, maybe higher on the totem pole than a lot of people get it credit for, because I don't feel like there's this general understanding that strength is good. In fact, in some ways, we're going the opposite approach. In some ways, strength, and maybe you could even say like competence, is starting to be seen as maybe not such an important thing anymore. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's partly where Peterson comes in, because he's made a great point about hierarchies of competence being something we should celebrate, not something we should reject. And yeah, I also think you made a good point there about the unity of the virtues. That was a Socratic position, that really the virtues are all different aspects of the four different key virtues are all aspects of the same excellence. And that brings us back to that Greek meaning of arete being excellence. So yes, I think in culture we, again, apart from things like music and sport, we do have a bit of a problem in recognizing and celebrating excellence. And that's perhaps where partly why it would be a good thing to start viewing it through the lens of strength, because we do recognize that from a sporting point of view, but we do have trouble recognizing it really on a moral level. And that brings us back to that original point. We don't really have a moral framework in culture except through proxies such as sport. People, and again, this is a point Peterson's made too. I know that when people see a great sporting achievement, they're moved and they want to celebrate and they get up out of their seats. That's something that makes that, as you pointed out, visceral connection with people. But on a moral level, in culture, we have a great deal of trouble recognizing it. We have trouble recognizing role models in a moral way.
Yes, and I've even seen, to talk about celebrating athletes, there are still some of those jocks out there that make it to the high level, and I've met these people, and I've also spoken to people who met them as well, and they always say kind of the same thing. It's like they're really strong, they're really great athletes, and they're a really good person, and then they'll go on to list all the things that make their character bad. They'll say, but they're really arrogant, but they have a big ego, and I thought about that a little bit recently because it seems to be the case that when you see excellence, your natural inclination is to think, well, he must also have a good character, or at least it's a desire to feel that way. You want to believe that if this person is really good, is really excellent at something, that it comes with moral character, but it doesn't always. And I think we're deeply confused about the difference and the connection, and sometimes lack of connection between excellence, or even like competence, and even moral virtue, or like a virtue ethic. I think we're confused.
I totally agree. And I think it would be easy to point to successful sporting figures who don't manifest good character. So that's where there's been a disconnect. And I think uh, and I think part of the reason people feel betrayed in a sense by when they maybe discover that a successful sporting person may be a drug cheat or whatever, they feel a sense of betrayal. And I think that's where the moral aspect comes into a certain extent. We think that excellence in sport should also go along with excellence in character. We have that kind of implicit assumption, and when that link is broken, um, we think there's something wrong. So I think, yeah, maybe that's where our kind of subconscious moral intuitions are coming through there. Because I think in general, as I indicated before, I think you don't get to be a highly successful sporting player without, for instance, the virtue of self-control. You just can't. You can't be very successful at anything without that virtue. So that's a given. But courage, wisdom, and justice, maybe maybe they take a little more work for someone in a for someone in a very prominent position.
Yes, but I would agree with that. And in my experience, it tends to be the ones who come into a sport late, because most really top end athletes start really young, but some come in late to the sport and they're really, really gifted. That's the link that I've made between, yes, you're good at the sport, but your character isn't so great, because they didn't have to go through the same level of difficulty. And so they have this, in a sense, a God complex of, look at these people started 10 years before me and I'm lifting more than them. And I think in some sense that's where that comes from, but who knows? I'm curious. Have you thought about why we're demonizing like virtue? Maybe virtue is a strong word, but even things like competence and strength. Like, have you thought about why our cultures seem to be leaning into that?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it probably happened in the 60s and 70s, I would say, with the when there was a kind of a sort of a folk, still a bit of a folk memory and a bit of a hangover from the Christian virtue framework, which in a lot of and again, I would say during the 20th century, there were good reasons why a lot of people turned away from Christianity in the 20th century. Two world wars, and the rise of Nazism and Stalinism probably made virtue seem pretty irrelevant, basically, um, or even kind of ridiculous. Um, and then, yeah, together with, as I say, the sort of the libertarian revolution of the 60s and 70s. But then we, as a culture, I guess in the 80s and 90s, we maybe found that, well, family breakdown isn't such a good thing. Widespread drug use isn't such a good thing. Has the sexual revolution brought anything really great for people's lives? Well, maybe not. And I think that's where this reaction, which is not necessarily kind of conscious or really aware, but I think that's, as I say, why we do have this looking for meaning and looking for frameworks that the Stoic revival, the rise of someone like Peterson, and we're also seeing it in the a lot of people are converting to traditional churches, particularly the Orthodox Church now. So I think there's a cultural reaction happening in the West. Um, Other people might point to different reasons for that, but I think it's because a lot of the societal problems we've seen, um, you know, as I mentioned with social media and reality TV, mass narcissism, even people who don't necessarily think about those things can see, well, that's not a good thing. Because we can also see it's led to a huge rise in mental health problems, particularly in young people. So there's a couple of different directions, I think, where this is coming from. But yeah, I think there is a need. I think there is a real um, crisis, and whether people are conscious of it or not, subconsciously, maybe they're looking for something to offer a framework that's been missing in the West for maybe 30, 40 years.
Hmm. But part of me thinks that it's what's tied in with that is how cushiony we've sort of made our culture as well. Like it used to be the case that if you weren't strong, you you didn't survive. It wasn't an option. Strength wasn't an option. And I mean both. I mean physical strength and also mental strength, because as we talked about, they go hand in hand in many ways. But even back, like when we were in tribes, I mean, you had to have a good character, because if you didn't, you weren't going to be part of the tribe. Because if you have bad character, if you're treacherous, if you're bitter, if you're resentful, well, guess what? We don't want you in our tribe, because you're a threat to the group's survival. And so I don't know. I feel like now we're at a place where, in the West in particular, it is quite cushiony. I mean, we just went through a COVID pandemic, and I'm not making any moral judgments on this, but the governments in Canada, at least, gave out a lot of money to people because they lost their jobs. And hey, that's probably a great thing. But the consequences of that now is that nobody wants to work. And so Now, obviously, I'm probably leaning more on the side that, yeah, we probably should do that. The government does have some kind of moral obligation. At the same time, when everything is handed to you, you lose the most primal motivation for you to succeed. And part of that success, not all the time, but mostly has to be tied in with something like a virtue ethic. I mean, we talk about how do you be successful in sports. They won't let you on the team if you're a crybaby, right? It's as simple as that. Um, but yeah, have you thought about maybe in some ways, like we've reached a point in technology where, I don't know, maybe we have too much comfort, or maybe we need to, maybe an antidote to that is we need to start putting in more challenges, not artificially, but in a sense promoting it from a cultural standpoint, that it's good to go in and do something difficult.
Yeah, I'd preface my remarks by saying that ever since Roman times, people have been saying, "Oh, people are too soft now. Got it too easy." So
Yeah, yeah, right,
you can see
right,
Cicero and Seneca saying the same thing.
right,
But
right.
so yeah, I preface my remarks with that. So it's a perennial thing to think, well, everybody today's got it far too easy. But I think you're actually right. I think we do have, and again, this is something of the last kind of, I guess, 30 years, and probably more in our countries, Australia and Canada, than in some other places in the West. But yes, we do. The welfare state is kind of it does give people a safety net, and again, that's another thing that's contributed to a lot of the problems we're seeing in society. When you've got two or three generations of people, none of whom have actually had a paying job, that's obviously not a good situation. It's not good for the health or the mental health of the people involved. So yes, I totally agree that we probably have made some of these problems for ourselves, culturally speaking, and technology's definitely contributed. But having worked in schools, and when you can see when it uh, you know welfare a welfare background isn't necessarily a life sentence. Kids can get out of that welfare trap, and the best way to encourage that is to enroll them in sport, help them to where parents can't if parents can't afford to enroll in a sport. Well, it'd be great if communities can help, and I know they do. Where kids can learn these skills, these self control, the teamwork that are going to be key to them actually getting a job, which is, welfare is one thing, but actually getting a job and having that confidence and that sense of achievement is key to success in life. Absolutely, I absolutely agree with that.
Hmm. Yeah, I think I mean, that is the meaning of life. I mean, in my very humble opinion, I mean, Ralph Waldo Emerson said it best. He said something like, the the goal of life is not to be happy, it's to be useful. And I do think that that's stoicism as well. I think it's
Absolutely.
it's like, be
100%.
useful.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's exactly right. That's what Marcus Aurelius says over and over again, to be useful to your fellow humans. And he doesn't see himself as elevated from them. He is one of he's one of the bees in the hive. That's what we all are.
Right.
We're all embedded in our communities, and to be useful is is what is best for us as humans.
Now, you mentioned narcissism several times here. Where do you see that manifesting itself the most? Like, when you say that, we have a very narcissistic society, where do you sort of see that bubbling up mostly?
Well, I'm Instagram. Yeah, I mean, it's possibly the first time in history where everybody's been able to record and transmit in real time everything they're doing, everything they're eating, everything they're wearing, and expecting thousands or millions of people to care. I mean, that's got to be. I think that's a first. And again, it's not a good thing. I'm sure it's not a good thing. Um, it's got to be linked to the rise in mental health problems, particularly in young women. You've got impossible beauty standards held up as the norm. That's got to be bad for young people growing up. And you've also and the focus on the visual too. I mean, that's obviously a something that's challenging. And in a sense, I would think it would be wonderful if young people were encouraged more to develop their characters and develop their skills than to obsess about what they look like on their phones constantly. So yeah, I think that's been part of that's again one of these other things feeding into where we find ourselves with a crisis of meaning. It's because we've, um, there's been these different impulses driving us towards a certain ideal, which is completely false. And
Yeah.
I just find it sad that for we had a prominent case in Sydney, my hometown, recently, where a socialite whose young child had a birthday, and the party was splashed across the newspapers. For that it cost $40,000. This children's birthday party. Well, what kind of values is that? It's I can just see children raised against that kind of background having a strange idea that that's the aim in life, is to splash a lot of money around, and that's such a distorted value system that some kids and superficially privileged kids are being given. So on the one hand, we've got disadvantaged kids in it from a welfare background who may not have any role models to aspire to. On the other hand, we've got very wealthy people at the same time who seem to have these very distorted values as well. So we've got two different undesirable, or at least very, I would say, unhealthy, and that brings us back to our idea about strength and health, very unhealthy approaches. So yes, there's a few different trends in culture, I think, that can uh, lead to ongoing problems.
Mm-hmm. It makes us modern philosophers. It makes a dilemma because I think we're struggling with this internally with the walled garden as well, because it's a question of, well, for you to save someone from drowning, you have to get in the damn water with them, right? And what I mean by that is, as as so I'm on board with you. I think social media is like 90% of the time it's misused poorly. There are some benefits to it, and there are ways that you can use it in a beneficial way. And the question that we have to ask ourselves, as I mean, if I had my way, I don't think I'd be on it at all. I think I'm on it now mostly for promotion, to promote the podcast and all that. Um, but yeah, I mean, it seems to be the case that for you to say go save people from Instagram, from a philosophical standpoint, it seems to be that you have to sort of engage into that world as well. And I think we're struggling to strike that balance, because it's kind of like Nietzsche's idea: if you stare into the abyss, it starts to stare back, right? And that's very, very true, because once you start engaging in something like Instagram or TikTok, you do get a little consumed by it. You can't help it. It's you're engaging in that environment, and you're going to be affected by it. So I think that's a hard balance, that's a challenge of our time, I think.
I think it is, but it's not only of our time. So you've got Seneca saying, we don't want to stand, as philosophers, we don't want to stand out. We've got to be part of the
Mm.
community. We've got to fit in. And he makes that point specifically. You if we stand out too much, then we're not going to persuade anyone, he says. So we've got to, and philosophers have a bad enough name anyway. He also adds, we don't want to add to that. We want to fit in and be part of the community. So I think, there is a balance to be struck, and I'm hoping
Yeah.
we can strike it. But I don't think that's necessarily new. I just think the forms it's taking are particularly new and particularly pathological in some respects.
So I have a question. I think if you were to try and convince someone, and I'm asking this because I really want to know the answer. If you're trying to convince someone to adopt a virtuous lifestyle, say, listen, like, life is about character, and it can be a young person, it can be someone who, I don't know, let's say someone that's wealthy, and they're sort of that child of wealth, sort of arrogant mentality, whatever the situation, like like what are sort of the bullet points of, like, listen, no, this is why you should develop your character, this is why you should focus on virtue.
I guess it comes back to the Platonic and Aristotelian Stoic ideal. It's eudaimonia, a life of good spirit, will only be achieved through living virtuously. The lifestyle of someone who likes to splash money around for show really, what's that achieving? It's not achieving happiness for them. It's not achieving happiness for the people they care about. Um, Status, that kind of status, is short-lived and very superficial. Ultimately, uh, the way to, and it's not happiness. Unfortunately, our translation happiness for eudaimonia is not really a good one. It'd be great if we had another word, but a fulfilled life, a life that's truly fulfilled, is one that is of good actions and service to others and commitment to improvement. Um, so that really, I would say, is the bullet points: service, uh, fulfillment, and commitment to improvement in whatever you undertake. And I suppose the last one would be, again, this is of course a very Stoic point as well, not to rely or to take too much account of what other people are going to think. If you care too much about what other people are going to think, then you're never going to do anything worthwhile. If you sit there waiting for your clicks and your likes, then you're not learning, you're not improving. So I would say those are the bullet points: service, fulfillment, improvement, and resistance, I guess, to uh, thinking about other people's opinion all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's how I would generally, in the most broadest sense of the word, define something like strength. It's the ability to resist. And you think about something like stoicism, like it's all you're doing is you're resisting. You're resisting temptation. You're resisting the pull of the crowd. You're resisting really the temptation to throw in Dostoevsky, to become the underground man, to fall into bitterness and resentment, and to tell to say things that are not true. I think it's all about resisting, and I think it really ties in with the start of the episode, which is virtue. Maybe the better word for virtue is something more like strength.
Yep, I would agree with that. I think you honing in on that idea of resistance is very key. And it can also come into courage, because
Mm.
part of courage can be resisting what you're being told to do. You know, we know about courageous acts from great people in the past. A lot of them have involved resisting something that they know to be wrong. So yeah, I think that's another key aspect to it.
Hmm. Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, I guess we're at an hour here, so we should probably wrap things up. But thank you so much for talking with me. That was very eye opening. I learned quite a bit. Um, so you're part of the Walled Garden now, which I am as well. We're all sort of part of this little growing philosophical society. So is that the best place people can find you? Is on the Walled Garden, or where would you point
Yep, on the
people
Wall
to?
Garden is a good place to find me. My grove is called Roots of the Garden. So I hope people will get involved. And as I say, we're starting up our Seneca series again soon. So I'm looking forward to that.
Awesome, awesome. And I do want to bring it up too that initially we were going to talk about Dostoevsky, and you brought up this topic, and I said, "Wow, that seems interesting," because I just released an episode on it, Stoicism and Exercise, and so it seemed timely. But uh, I'd love to have you back to talk about Dostoevsky too, because it's well, he's my favorite author, and to find someone who's also nerdy about him as well, I think is a privilege. So hopefully sometime we can talk about him.
I'd love to do that. Thanks, Brandon.
Thanks again so much. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye.